Is your overthinking a symptom of anxiety or a sign of distant faith? What does Islam actually teach us about managing generalized anxiety disorder when your mind is a storm? In this cinematic breakdown, we unpack the clinical insights and prophetic tools from Season 1, Episode 3 of our wellness series, synthesizing the best of psychology and spiritual care. We are formatting this as a supportive, step-by-step guide. So let's dive into this explainer and begin our journey of understanding the modern mind through a lens of timeless faith.
I really want us to sit with this opening question for a second, because honestly, how we define our struggle completely changes how we heal from it. So often, we confuse an exhausted, anxious brain with some sort of spiritual failing. But as we're going to see, recognizing the clinical reality of anxiety actually empowers our faith, rather than taking away from it.
To find these answers, we're building a truly comprehensive framework today. We aren't just looking at therapy, and we aren't just looking at theology. We're actually harmonizing clinical cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, with divine wisdom to bring you real, lasting peace. Here is our roadmap to relief today. We'll be walking through 6 key steps: understanding your anxious mind, sorting your daily worries, finding stillness in prayer, healing through the Quran, activating prophetic tools, and reframing distress through faith. Let's jump right in. Step 1. Understanding your anxious mind. We're going to start by completely destigmatizing what you're feeling and bringing some much-needed clinical clarity to the table.
Look at the clinical definition of generalized anxiety disorder here. It's not just, your everyday stress from a busy week. It's an excessive, persistent fear of the unknown future and a deep intolerance to uncertainty. The source material points out that we are seeing the massive rise of an anxious generation post-COVID. People are suffering heavily from an inability to handle the unknown. Our modern environment is just so full of overwhelming expectations, making it incredibly hard to just be at peace with what we don't know.
And this mental toll, it translates into very real physical and cognitive symptoms. We're talking racing hearts, tight chests, sweaty flashes, blurry vision, and just constantly catastrophizing the future. Sometimes it even leads to avoiding your responsibilities simply because the fear is way too draining. It is absolutely crucial to validate these symptoms. Realizing that your distress is an excessive emotional response and definitely not a lack of faith, well, that's the very first step toward healing.
Step 2. Sorting your daily worries. This is where we equip you with an actionable toolkit and where clinical therapy starts doing some heavy lifting.
Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches us to literally sort our racing thoughts into 2 distinct buckets: practical worries versus hypothetical worries. Say you get a flat tire on the way to work. That's a practical worry, right? It's a controllable issue, you problem solve it, and you fix it. But a hypothetical worry? Like lying awake at 2 a.m. terrified you might fail an exam that's still 6 months away? That's an uncontrollable future fear requiring you to let go, and it demands a completely different strategy.
So what do we do with those uncontrollables? CBT offers this brilliant technique. Acknowledge the hypothetical worry, and then actually schedule a daily worry time. Literally, set a specific meeting with yourself just to worry. By compartmentalizing your hypothetical fears into this scheduled time slot, you bring your attention fully back to the present moment for the rest of the day. It completely stops anxiety from hijacking your entire life. Step 3. Finding stillness in prayer. Now we get to step into the spiritual realm and synthesize that secular psychology with our incredibly rich spiritual toolkit.
You hear the word mindfulness thrown around constantly in modern therapy, but for a believer, true mindfulness is khushu, total, profound attentiveness during salah or prayer. Think about it. You can't just take a few deep breaths to stop a panic attack if your mind is still completely chaotic. You must ground your focus. When you achieve genuine presence and concentration in prayer, you invite a natural, powerful calmness to wash right over that panicked mind.
And when CBT tells you to let go of a hypothetical worry, the beautiful Islamic equivalent to that is tawakkul. You do your best and let Allah do the rest. The source material perfectly compares this to Prophet Musa at the river. With an entire army closing in behind him and an impassable ocean in front of him, he did his part and he trusted Allah's plan entirely. We let go by leaving our uncontrollable futures safely in the hands of the Creator.
Step 4. Healing through the Quran. Let's see how this builds into an actionable daily routine to clear out all that mental noise. Just 20 minutes. That's it. Setting aside a dedicated time block of just 10 to 20 minutes a day, strictly for the Quran, can dramatically reset your mental state, especially when you feel completely overwhelmed by overthinking. During this healing time block, you read or listen with the timer, and you literally put all of your worldly problems on pause. You just ponder deeply. Even if it's just on a single ayah,
By intentionally disconnecting from the chaos of the world and connecting with the words of Allah, you're letting the Quran act as a literal shifa, or a cure, for the ailments of your heart. And the amazing thing is, after those 20 minutes, people very often find natural clarity and the exact problem-solving solutions they were panicking over just half an hour earlier. Step 5. Activating prophetic tools. Let's turn our attention to the incredible coping mechanisms modeled directly by the Prophet Muhammad.
One of the most powerful tools we have is community, specifically keeping ties of kinship. Anxiety naturally wants to isolate you. It wants you trapped all alone in your own head. But actively discussing your thoughts with a strong support network of family and good friends, that breaks the overthinking cycle. It quite literally shrinks the size of your internal worries. Because, as we know, two heads problem-solving are always better than one.
Our ultimate mental defense lies in prophetic cognitive affirmations. These operate exactly like positive cognitive affirmations in therapy. The Prophet Muhammad frequently sought refuge from ham, the worry of the future, and hazan, the sorrow of the past, reciting du'as like, "O Allah, I am your slave," or asking to make the Quran the life of my heart, a departure from my sorrow and release for anxiety, actively rewires your brain. It reminds you that control gracefully remains in the hands of the Creator.
Step 6. Reframing distress through faith. We reach our conclusion today with the ultimate paradigm shift for anyone suffering silently with their mental health.
There is a profoundly comforting hadith we really need to internalize here. No Muslim is afflicted with any difficulty, continuous pain, anxiety, grief, without Allah thereby making it an expiation for his sins. Your emotional injury, your mental exhaustion, your grief, and your anxiety are never ever ignored by Allah. They are actively purifying you. Having emotional pain is intensely challenging, of course, but shifting your mindset to realize it actually serves as an expiation for your sins, that changes the entire experience of suffering.
So the big takeaway here is this: do not despair in the mercy of Allah. The source material beautifully references Prophet Yaqub, who never lost hope despite unimaginable, prolonged grief over losing his sons. He just knew relief was coming. We have to view our psychological storms through this exact same lens of divine wisdom. Emotional distress is a trial to navigate, not a punishment to be crushed by.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to remember that your pain is seen. Your faith is your anchor, and you now have the clinical and spiritual tools to fight back against the storm in your mind. Armed with clinical tools and prophetic wisdom, how will you reframe your worries today? Thank you so much for learning with me, and I truly hope this sparks your journey toward finding real inner peace.
You know the exact feeling. It is 3 a.m. The rest of the house is completely silent. You know, the world is asleep, but your eyes are just wide open, staring at the ceiling in the dark.
Right, and your heart is hammering.
Exactly, this frantic, erratic rhythm against your ribs. Your breathing is shallow. And tomorrow, which, I mean, let's be honest, is technically today now, feels just impossibly suffocatingly heavy.
Yeah.
Your mind is running this relentless marathon of hypotheticals, projecting 10 steps into a future you basically can't control. And if you are listening to this right now, you have probably been in that exact bed. Or, you know, if you love someone who spends half their nights there.
It is a completely visceral, undeniable, physical reality. I mean, it isn't just a fleeting, nervous thought brushing past your consciousness. It's a full-body takeover.
Right.
Your sympathetic nervous system has essentially hijacked your brain, flooding your bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. Like your pupils are literally dilating in the dark, searching for a predator that just does not exist.
What?
Yeah. And while we so often treat that 3 a.m. spiral as like a modern glitch, some sort of personal failure to cope with everyday life, it is actually a profound biological response. And it's colliding with a deeply complex psychological and spiritual state.
And that collision is exactly what we are dissecting today. We are taking a deep dive into this incredibly rich dialogue between Abdul Wahid and Hashil. And what they have done, and what we are going to expand on today, is synthesize clinical psychology, specifically CBT, with profound Islamic teachings on mental wellness.
Which is such a needed synthesis.
It really is. And I want to set a very clear, empathetic tone right from the jump here. If you are sitting there feeling guilty about your anxiety, you know, thinking it means your faith is weak, we need to completely dismantle that idea right now.
Absolutely.
We are not here to dismiss clinical anxiety as a spiritual failure. That is not just a harmful misconception. It's fundamentally inaccurate to the theology.
It's highly destructive, honestly. It leaves people feeling doubly burdened. Because, I mean, you are already suffering from the physiological torment of the anxiety itself.
Yeah, the physical toll is massive.
Right. And then you are layering on this immense guilt of feeling anxious, assuming you are somehow spiritually broken. So we are approaching anxiety today as a deeply valid psychological reality that also functions as a complex spiritual test.
Which is a huge reframe.
It is. We are going to examine what it actually looks like when generalized anxiety bleeds into your spiritual life, what those spiritual symptoms actually look like, and how to precisely integrate clinical therapy with deeply rooted concepts like tawakkul, which is the active reliance on God.
But before we start handing out tools, I feel like we need to understand the anatomy of this beast. Abdul Wahid and Hashil define anxiety in this beautifully succinct way. They basically call it an intolerance to uncertainty.
That's a great definition.
Right. It is an absolute rejection of the unknown, a fear of the now, and a terror of the future. So if we look at the modern landscape, there is a very specific reason we keep hearing this described as an epidemic, especially in this, post-COVID era.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion right now around the great rewiring of childhood.
Yeah.
It's a concept brought up in Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation.
Yes, exactly.
The whole argument is that the fundamental baseline of how human beings interact with the world has been completely altered. That rewiring is the shift from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood.
And that just shattered our baseline tolerance for uncertainty, didn't it?
Completely shattered it. We are living in an era of hyper-awareness. I mean, let's look at the mechanics of why that intolerance to uncertainty is so high right now. The human brain is essentially a prediction machine. It wants to know what happens next so it can keep you safe. When you live in a highly localized, predictable environment, the brain relaxes. But today, we are constantly mainlining global uncertainties, economic crashes, pandemics, global conflicts, straight through our screens.
Just 24/7.
Exactly. Straight into our nervous systems. The brain simply cannot compute that level of continuous, low-grade, unpredictable threat.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second because this is something that always bothers me when people talk about the modern anxiety epidemic. Hasn't human life always been deeply, horrifyingly uncertain?
Oh, for sure.
I mean, think about someone living in the 14th century during the Black Death or, during a massive historical famine. Why is this generation uniquely struggling, falling apart at the seams over, an ambiguous text message, when previous generations survived literal plagues without this epidemic of generalized anxiety?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
Is it actually more common today, or are we just pathologizing normal human emotion because we finally have the language for it?
Yeah, right.
It is a nuanced mix of both, but there's a very distinct difference in the type of uncertainty. In the 14th century, the threats were acute and immediate. A famine is a practical physical threat. You respond with physical action.
That makes sense.
Today, our threats are chronic and hypothetical. You aren't running from a tiger. You are sitting at a desk for 8 hours worrying about inflation or your social standing or, like you said, an email.
So the body is mounting a massive defense against a shadow.
Precisely. Your body is mounting a physiological defense against a threat you cannot physically fight or flee from. And historically, there was a massive cultural stigma, too.
Oh, yeah. Generations ago, the prevailing coping mechanism was basically just put your head down, suppress the emotion, and get to work.
Right, because they had to build resilience on the fly. The alternative was starvation. But now, post-COVID, we've had this massive cultural pendulum swing. You open any social media app and you have thousands of influencers openly normalizing mental health struggles.
Which has a dual effect, I'd imagine.
It really does. On one hand, it is wonderful that the stigma is dissolving. People need to talk about this. But on the other hand, it creates an environment of emotional hypervigilance.
Like we're constantly diagnosing ourselves.
Exactly. When you constantly consume content about panic attacks and trauma, you start analyzing your own mental state obsessively. You feel a normal flutter of nervousness before a meeting, and because of this hyper-awareness, you mislabel it as a clinical panic attack.
Wow, so you elevate a normal human emotion into a pathological event.
Yes, and that leads directly to the generational clash we are seeing everywhere. In offices, at dinner tables, the older generation looks at the younger generation and says, just get on with it, we did.
Because their blunt tool of emotional suppression kind of worked for them, even if it gave them ulcers.
Right, but the younger generation has thrown away that blunt tool. They recognize suppression as toxic. They want their emotional reality validated. But here's the massive gap. They haven't picked up a new tool yet.
So they're just left exposed.
Exactly. They want to be heard, but they lack the foundational resilience training to navigate the storm once they are standing in it. Think about a flat tire.
Okay.
Decades ago, if you got a flat tire, it was a nuisance. But the mechanics of fixing it were a given. You pull over, you jack up the car, you change the tire. The resilience was built into the lived experience.
You just knew what to do.
Right. But today, a minor mechanical failure like a flat tire can induce a full-blown physiological panic response in someone if they haven't been given the practical tools or the psychological resilience to handle it.
So the brain interprets the flat tire not as a problem to be solved, but as a catastrophic failure of safety. They just freeze.
Exactly.
They freeze. So we essentially have a generation standing in the rain, staring at a flat tire, completely paralyzed. To build a new toolkit, we really have to understand the anatomy of that freeze response. Because as we established with that 3 a.m. scenario, a panic attack isn't just a mental glitch. Your body is actively betraying you. Let's break down the clinical presentation of this. What is the actual architecture of anxiety?
Clinically, we categorize it into 3 distinct pillars: the physical, the emotional or cognitive, and the behavioral.
Okay, let's start with the physical.
The physical is the foundation. It is the trembling hands, the rapid heartbeat, the tightness in your chest that literally makes you think you are having a cardiac event.
It's terrifying.
It really is. Your vision might actually blur because your pupils are dilating to take in more light. Your digestive system shuts down, which is why you feel nauseous, because your body is diverting all blood flow to your major muscle groups to run away.
Right, and that intense physical state just completely hijacks the second pillar, which is your cognition, your thoughts. You are terrified. You start catastrophizing every little thing.
Exactly. And then because your brain and body are completely exhausted by this internal war, it leads to the third pillar, the behavioral symptoms, which almost always manifests as avoidance.
Avoidance, yeah, that makes sense.
Avoidance is the most insidious part of the cycle. We avoid the situation that triggered the anxiety to stay in our perceived safe zone, but the neurological consequence of that is disastrous.
How so?
Well, by staying in the comfort zone, you are actively feeding the fear. You are teaching your amygdala, the fear center of the brain, that the only reason you survive today is because you avoided the trigger. You validate the false alarm.
Okay, let's make this incredibly concrete for the listener.
Yeah.
How do therapists actually map this out so a patient can see the cycle they are trapped in? Because when you are in it, it just feels like chaos.
They use a situational framework called the 5 areas model. It basically forces the analytical part of your brain back online by making you map out the chaos.
Walk me through it.
Let's say you are sitting at home on a Friday at 4:55 p.m. and your boss sends a one-line email. We need to talk first thing Monday morning.
Oh, that is brutal. That ruins the entire weekend immediately.
Exactly. So let's map it. Area 1, your situation, the email. Area 2, your thoughts, I'm getting fired. I made a mistake on that report. I'm going to lose my apartment.
The spiral starts instantly.
Instantly. Area 3, your physical sensations, your stomach drops, your chest tightens, you start sweating. Area 4, your emotional feelings, pure dread, terror, inadequacy.
And the 5th area?
Finally, Area 5, your behavior. You spend the entire weekend avoiding your phone, you don't eat, you snap at your partner, and you mentally prepare to be unemployed.
Wow. When you lay it out like that, you can clearly see how the thought dictates the physical response, which dictates the behavior. But, this is the secular clinical model. What I found absolutely fascinating in the discussion between Abdulwahid and Hashil is how they introduce a dimension that mainstream psychology completely ignores.
The spiritual dimension.
Exactly. The intersection of clinical panic and spiritual restlessness. In the Islamic tradition, they note that the Prophet Muhammad would actively race to prayer to find tranquility during times of worry. The spiritual connection is supposed to be this ultimate safe harbor.
But this creates a massive, agonizing dilemma for someone suffering from a clinical anxiety disorder. If you are told that prayer or reading scripture or spiritual connection is the ultimate source of peace, but you approach it while locked in that physiological panic response we just mapped out, you are going to hit a massive wall.
Yes. If you are listening to this right now and thinking, well, I tried meditating or praying during a panic attack and it just made everything worse, this is exactly why.
It's biological.
I mean, imagine your anxious mind is a speeding car going 100 miles an hour. Entering a spiritual space, like stepping onto a prayer mat or opening the Quran, is like trying to parallel park that speeding car into a tiny, quiet garage without hitting the brakes first.
That's a great analogy.
It is literally impossible. You're going to smash through the back wall, the car is going to be wrecked, and then you are going to blame yourself for not being a good enough driver.
That is the perfect way to visualize the spiritual block. You cannot simultaneously experience a biological fight-or-flight response with your heart racing and cortisol pumping and spiritual tranquility.
They just reject each other.
The two states are biologically incompatible. True mindfulness in prayer, like Islamic Salah, isn't some magical passive Zen state that just washes over you the second you start. It requires profound active attention. It requires the prefrontal cortex to be fully engaged.
So when your amygdala has hijacked your brain, scattering your attention to the wind, the spiritual symptom of your anxiety is this crushing feeling of total disconnect. You are physically going through the motions of worship. You are bowing, you are reading the words, but you feel absolutely zero peace. And because you feel no peace, the catastrophizing bleeds into your theology. You think, why isn't God comforting me? Am I spiritually dead? Am I a hypocrite?
Which is such a dark place to be.
But the reality is your soul isn't dead. Your nervous system is just overwhelmed. You basically haven't hit the brakes on the car.
Precisely. That lack of connection in the moment is not a failure of your faith. It is a symptom of your biology. You have to be physiologically present to become spiritually calm.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
If your mind is projecting 10 years into a hypothetical, terrifying future, you simply cannot access the divine tranquility of the present moment. So the urgent question becomes, if we cannot force spiritual tranquility during a clinical panic response, how do we use the science of psychology to physically hit the brakes?
And this is where we cross the bridge into clinical interventions. Abdul-Wahid and Hashil highlight CBT as the primary secular tool to rewire the brain's alarm system.
Right.
The premise of CBT is that you can't always control the initial physiological spike, but by changing how you think about it and how you behave in response to it, you can manually override the panic.
The first, most critical step in CBT for an anxious brain is threat categorization. You have to categorize the monster in the room. In the clinical framework, we divide this into two distinct types of worry: practical worry and hypothetical worry.
Okay, we need to dig into this.
If you cannot distinguish between these two, you will exhaust yourself fighting shadows.
Let's clearly define them. So practical worry is tethered to reality. It involves things that are actually happening and are within your control.
Right, let's go back to the flat tire.
Perfect. You are stranded on the shoulder of the highway. That is a real, tangible, immediate problem. The clinical intervention for practical worry is very straightforward problem solving.
Exactly. You do not need to sit on the side of the road and psychoanalyze your relationship with the concept of rubber tires.
Right. You need to call a tow truck, or you need to get the jack out of the trunk. You convert the anxiety into a task, and you complete the task.
But then we have the infinitely more exhausting category, which is hypothetical worry.
The what ifs.
Yes, this is future-based, entirely out of your current control, and usually starts with what if. What if I fail that exam next month and ruin my career?
Yeah.
What if this random headache is an aggressive brain tumor? What if the economy collapses tomorrow?
And because you can't take immediate action, what do you do?
Well, because you cannot take immediate practical action to solve a hypothetical what if, the clinical intervention in CBT is fundamentally different. The intervention for hypothetical worry is letting go and aggressively anchoring your attention back to the present moment.
Okay, hold on. Letting go, that sounds beautiful on like a yoga retreat brochure. But when you were at the mercy of a 3 a.m. panic spiral, telling someone to just let it go is infuriating.
It feels dismissive.
It feels impossible. But they detail a very specific, almost counterintuitive CBT technique to actually force the brain to let go, and it is called worry time.
It is brilliant because it works with the brain's natural tendencies instead of against them. The concept of worry time acknowledges that you cannot just delete a thought. If I tell you right now, whatever you do, do not think about a pink elephant, what is the only thing in your mind?
A pink elephant, obviously.
Exactly. Suppression makes thoughts rebound with twice the intensity. So instead of suppressing the hypothetical worry or allowing it to bleed into every single hour of your day and drain your executive function, you allocate a very specific, rigidly contained window of time specifically for worrying.
Like booking a meeting with your own anxiety. You say, okay, 4:0 p.m. to 4:20 p.m. is my scheduled worry time. But mechanically, how does this actually help? Doesn't scheduling an appointment to freak out just guarantee that you are going to ruin your Tuesday afternoon?
It relies on the psychology of containment. When a hypothetical worry like, what if I get fired next month, pops into your head at 10 a.m., your brain demands an immediate emotional response.
Right.
But with this technique, instead of fighting the thought or spiraling into it, you simply acknowledge it. You write it down on a piece of paper or in your phone, and you cognitively defer it. You literally tell your brain, I see this threat, I have logged it, we have a scheduled meeting to review it at 4 p.m. I do not need to process it right now.
You put it in a waiting room. And the fascinating thing is, by the time 4 p.m. rolls around, you sit down with your list of worries from the day, and you look at that note from 10 a.m. And suddenly, outside of the heat of the moment, the emotional charge has completely evaporated.
It really does.
You look at, what if I get fired next month? And your brain just says, well, that's a problem for next month. I don't even want to worry about this right now.
Precisely. You are reclaiming your executive function.
Yeah.
You are training your amygdala that just because a threat is perceived doesn't mean it requires an immediate biological response.
That is so empowering.
It fundamentally rewires how your brain processes intrusive thoughts.
Yeah.
And what is incredible today is how accessible this rewiring process has become. You don't necessarily need to sit in a therapist's office for 6 months to learn this. The discussion heavily emphasizes the rise of digital interventions.
Yes. Apps like MindShift, CBT, WorryTree, and Anxiety Ease. These aren't just, meditation timers. They are literally clinical frameworks coded into software in your pocket.
Which is huge for accessibility.
Right. If you are someone whose social anxiety makes the idea of calling a therapist and sitting in a waiting room feel like climbing Mount Everest, these apps completely remove the barrier to entry. They walk you through the 5 areas model. They prompt you to categorize your worry as practical or hypothetical.
They act as immediate cognitive interrupters. They provide structured thought journaling and behavioral flowcharts. Now, to be clear, they don't replace intensive one-to-one therapy for severe clinical disorders, but they provide a foundational baseline of psychoeducation. They give the user an immediate sense of agency over their own biology.
But this brings us to the absolute crux of this deep dive, the friction point between secular psychology and spiritual reality. CBT tells us we must let go of hypothetical worries. We log them, we defer them, we schedule them, and ultimately we release them because we cannot practically control them.
Right.
But for a person of deep faith, this secular therapeutic model has a gaping hole. Where exactly are we letting these worries go to? Are we just dropping our deepest fears into a chaotic, indifferent void?
This is exactly where secular psychology reaches its structural limit, and where the synthesis with Islamic teachings provides something incredibly profound. This is the heart of Abdul-Wahid and Hashil's dialogue. When secular CBT says let it go, Islam says leave it with Allah.
This is the theological concept of tawakkul.
Yes, tawakkul.
Active reliance. It completely shifts the paradigm from a passive secular resignation, like I can't control this, so I give up, to an active divine transaction. I have done my part, and now I am handing this over to the ultimate authority.
It's a huge shift.
But wait, I need to push back here because this is where people get confused. Letting go and leaving it to God sounds an awful lot like spiritual bypassing. How is tawakkul different from just burying your head in the sand and waiting for a miracle?
That is a critical distinction to make. Tawakkul is not passivity. The classic Islamic teaching is tie your camel and then place your trust in God. You must take the practical action first. To illustrate this perfectly, they bring up the historical and theological example of Moses, or Musa, at the Red Sea. From a purely psychological perspective, Musa is facing the ultimate apocalyptic, anxiety-inducing scenario.
Paint the picture for us. What is actually happening in that moment?
He has led his people out of Egypt. They reach the edge of the Red Sea, a literal, insurmountable geographical dead end. Behind them, the horizon is dark, with the chariots of the greatest, most lethal army in the world charging directly at them with the intent to slaughter.
Just a completely terrifying scenario.
The people with Musa are in full-blown, justified panic. Their amygdalas are screaming. They are catastrophizing, saying out loud, "We are overtaken. This is the end."
Talk about an environment of total uncertainty. The physical and emotional symptoms of everyone around him are maxed out. But look at Musa's response. He doesn't succumb to the hypothetical terror of the swords hitting them. He doesn't freeze, and he doesn't just sit down on the sand and wait to die. He says, "No, my Lord is with me. He will guide me through." And then he takes the single, physical, practical step available to him in that exact moment. He strikes the water with his staff.
Exactly. If we overlay the clinical framework we just discussed onto this ancient story, Musa executed the perfect synthesis. He did not engage in the behavioral symptom of avoidance or despair. He categorized the threat.
He tied the camel.
Right. He took the practical action within his immediate control, striking the water, and then he let go of the uncontrollable outcome, how the water would actually part by leaving it entirely with God. He converted hypothetical terror into tawakkul.
And what's truly mind-bending is how this theological framework actively supercharges the clinical recovery process by reframing the experience of suffering itself.
Yeah.
The dialogue mentions a secular book titled Living with the Enemy.
Yes.
And that title perfectly encapsulates the secular view of anxiety. It is a hostile invader, a glitch, an enemy you are at war with. But then they contrast that with a profound hadith, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, which completely rewrites the narrative of pain.
It is one of the most powerful reframes in the tradition. The hadith states that no Muslim is afflicted by difficulty, continuous pain, anxiety, grief, injury, or even care, down to something as microscopic as the prick of a thorn, without it being an expiation for their sins.
Oh.
Every single ounce of emotional, psychological, and physical distress serves a direct spiritual purpose.
I love how they phrase this, but we need to tread carefully here. Again, this does not mean the anxiety is a punishment. It means the endurance of the anxiety is a purification.
Yes, that is key.
Think about what this does to the brain. In clinical terms, what happens when you introduce that level of meaning to suffering?
In psychology, we call this establishing a positive cognition set. Human beings can endure almost unimaginable amounts of pain if they believe the pain has a purpose.
Right, like running a marathon.
Exactly. What makes anxiety so devastating in a purely secular framework is the belief that the suffering is random, pointless, and indicative of a chaotic universe. It is just a cruel glitch in your brain chemistry.
But the Islamic paradigm says, no, this is not a glitch. Your endurance of that 3 a.m. panic attack, every racing heartbeat, every tear of frustration, is actively cleansing your soul. It is being recorded and rewarded.
It gives it immense value.
That changes the entire landscape of the battle. You are no longer living with the enemy. You are navigating a rigorous, highly customized, deeply rewarding test. It takes the venom right out of the suffering.
And navigating that test requires a very nuanced understanding of the emotion of fear itself. You can't just label all fear as bad. Abdul Wahid and Hashil break down the spectrum of fear from an Islamic perspective, which is crucial for managing anxiety.
How do they break it down?
They categorize fear into 3 distinct types. First, there's natural fear, like Musa's initial fear of the army, or you feeling terrified if a car swerves into your lane. This is biologically necessary for survival. It is completely valid.
Then there's the second category, reverent fear, or khawf. This is the awe, the deep consciousness, and the respect of God. It is a healthy, orienting fear that acts as a moral compass. It keeps you grounded. But it's the third category that directly overlaps with the most destructive forms of clinical anxiety. And that is haram, or forbidden fear.
Yes. Haram fear is fundamentally defined as despairing of God's mercy. It is the absolute total loss of hope. It is the cognitive distortion that tells you your situation is so dark, your uncertainty is so overwhelming, and your future is so doomed that even divine intervention cannot save you.
It's completely closing the door.
Exactly. It is elevating a hypothetical worry into a catastrophic, unchangeable certainty, thereby denying the power of God to change it.
So understanding this overarching theological philosophy, the tawakkul, the reframing of the suffering, the strict boundary against despair is vital. It gives us the map. But a map doesn't always stop your hands from shaking when the cortisol hits.
Very true.
Philosophy is great at 2 p.m. on a sunny afternoon. It is really hard to access at 3 a.m. in the dark. So what are the exact on-the-ground practical tools? How do we integrate these concepts into immediate relief?
This is where the dialogue moves from theory to profound practicality. They detail specific prophetic tools that bridge mental wellness and spiritual growth. And the first major tool they discuss is what we can call the Quranic time block.
Okay.
This takes the CBT concept of structured attention and elevates it to a spiritual level.
The tradition literally refers to the Quran as shifa, a cure for ailments of the heart and mind. And the practical technique suggested here isn't just to casually read a few pages. It is to set a rigid timer, say 20 minutes, dedicated solely to reading and tadabbur.
Right, which is deep, active, analytical pondering of the text.
But mechanically, how does reading an ancient text stop a modern panic attack?
It comes down to neuroscience. When you are caught in a generalized anxiety spiral, a network in your brain called the default mode network is highly active. It is churning out endless hypothetical threats, projecting into the future.
You are trapped in an internal echo chamber.
Precisely. By forcing your attention onto complex, deeply meaningful, linguistically rich text for 20 unbroken minutes, you are executing a massive cognitive interrupter.
You are forcing the brain to change gears. You are making the prefrontal cortex work to translate, understand, and ponder the meaning, which actively pulls energy away from the panicked amygdala.
Yes.
You are physically hitting the brakes on the speeding car by demanding that the brain process the immediate, profound present.
Exactly. And the anecdotal evidence shared in the discussion is striking. Often, by the time that 20-minute alarm rings, the physiological panic response, the heart rate, the shallow breathing has completely subsided because the brain was forced to focus elsewhere.
That's incredible.
And even more incredibly, because the panic has subsided, your executive function is back online. Suddenly, the mind is clear enough to actually yield practical solutions to the original worries.
This aligns so perfectly with the historical scholarship on spiritual wellness. They bring in the work of Ibn Qayyim, a towering classical Islamic scholar who outlined 5 specific remedies of the heart for deep emotional distress.
Yes.
The first, as we just unpacked, is reciting the Quran with deep pondering. But the second remedy he lists is incredibly physical, which I found totally fascinating for a spiritual scholar to point out.
The second remedy is maintaining an empty stomach, or specifically, avoiding excessive consumption and overeating.
I mean, why does a spiritual scholar care about my digestion when I'm having a panic attack?
Because hundreds of years before modern science mapped the gut-brain axis, scholars like Ibn Qayyim understood that the physical, emotional, and spiritual are inextricably linked. Modern neuroscience now knows that we have an enteric nervous system, literally a second brain in our gut.
Right, the microbiome.
Exactly. The vast majority of your body's serotonin, the neurotransmitter responsible for mood regulation and calm, is produced in the gut microbiome.
So if you are chronically overeating, especially heavily processed foods, you are overwhelming your digestive system. Your body becomes lethargic. Your vagus nerve, which connects the gut to the brain and controls your ability to calm down, basically becomes sluggish.
Exactly.
If your physical vessel is weighed down and inflamed, your mind is going to be incredibly susceptible to negative emotional spirals. You cannot separate spiritual lightness from physical discipline.
It is holistic care at its finest, which brings us to Ibn Qayyim's third remedy-making dua, supplication or intense personal prayer in the last third of the night. Now, think about the clinical presentation of anxiety we started with, the 3 a.m. spiral.
Yes. The last third of the night is exactly when the anxiety is usually the most terrifying. It is silent, you are alone with your thoughts, and the darkness feels oppressive. But this remedy completely flips the script.
It reclaims the hour.
In the Islamic tradition, the last third of the night is considered the time of most profound spiritual closeness, where God is most accessible to the prayers of the believer.
You are taking the exact same wakeful hour, the exact same physical space, and transforming it. Instead of the silence of the night feeling isolating and terrifying, it becomes an exclusive, intimate audience with the divine.
Wow.
You are reclaiming that 3 a.m. hour. You take all that frantic, hypothetical energy and you pour it into direct, active supplication.
And the fourth remedy leads directly into the clinical importance of social connectivity keeping righteous gatherings. Abdul Wahid and Hashil make a massive point about this in their dialogue. Isolation is the absolute breeding ground for catastrophizing.
It really is.
When you are alone in your own head, an unanswered email turns into, I'm going to be homeless in about 4 seconds. Every molehill becomes a mountain.
From a clinical standpoint, social connectivity is a frontline defense against anxiety because of a mechanism called co-regulation. Our nervous systems are literally designed to sync with the nervous systems of the people around us.
That is amazing.
Yeah, when you are spiraling and you sit down with a grounded, supportive friend or family member, their calm nervous system literally helps downregulate your panicked nervous system.
It is the ultimate reality check. You voice your hypothetical, formless fears out loud, and a good friend helps you shrink them back down to manageable sizes. They help you categorize like, hey, that is a hypothetical worry, let it go. This part is practical, let's solve it together. You don't have to carry the boulder alone.
And finally, the discussion details the ultimate tools for when the anxiety peaks the specific prophetic duas. These are prayers taught by the Prophet Muhammad, but when you analyze them through a psychological lens, they function as the ultimate CBT affirmations.
There are 2 deeply powerful duas analyzed in the material, and they are packed with neurological brilliance.
Let's look at the first one.
The first one is a masterclass in cognitive reframing. It is a longer prayer, but it begins with the individual explicitly acknowledging their status as a slave of Allah. Now, I want to pause here because in modern English, the word slave carries horrific, traumatic connotations. But in this theological context, what does this declaration actually do to the anxious ego?
In this context, it is a profound, relieving declaration of surrendering the ego. Anxiety is often driven by a subconscious belief that we must control every outcome to be safe.
Right.
By declaring yourself a servant to the divine, you are acknowledging that you are not the master of the universe. You are stepping down from the impossible job of controlling every hypothetical future. You are resigning as the general manager of the universe.
I love that. Resigning as the general manager of the universe. And the phrasing that follows is so incredibly specific. You say to God, my forelock is in your hand. The forelock is the front of the head, right over the forehead. Mechanically, what sits right behind the forehead?
The frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah. This is literally the center of decision-making, planning, and executive function in the human brain.
Exactly. The very center of your brain that is currently burning out, trying to plan for 1,000 hypothetical disasters. By verbally saying, my forelock is in your hand, you are taking your overactive, anxious planning center and explicitly, physically surrendering it to God's just decree.
Wow.
You are executing the ultimate tawakkul. You are saying, I have planned all I can, and now I am handing the steering wheel over to you. This verbalization actively downregulates the amygdala because you are formally transferring the burden of safety to a higher power.
It is a complete cognitive shift, and the dua continues by asking for the Quran to be the spring of the heart and the departure of sorrow and anxiety. The second dua they mention is just as targeted, but it is much shorter. It specifically asks God for refuge from two very specific things. Al-Ham, which translates to the worry of the future, and Al-Huzn, the heavy grief of the past.
It perfectly brackets the entire spectrum of human mental anguish. Anxiety is almost always the terror of the future, Al-Ham, and depression is almost always the heavy, unchangeable grief of the past, Al-Huzn.
That covers everything.
By asking for refuge from both, this dua is asking for the divine strength to remain anchored in the present moment. It is exactly what CBT and mindfulness are trying to achieve, but it is imbued with immense, transcendent spiritual power.
To tie all of this together, the grief, the worry, the reliance, and the action, Abdul Wahid and Hashil beautifully highlight the story of the prophet Yaqub or Jacob. Yaqub experiences unimaginable, catastrophic trauma. He loses his deeply beloved son, Joseph. He doesn't just get a flat tire. His entire world is shattered.
Completely shattered.
He is engulfed in an ocean of grief. The text says his eyes turned white from sorrow. He is experiencing maximum emotional distress.
But his response provides the ultimate blueprint for navigating the anxiety of the unknown. He does not fall into haram fear. He doesn't tell his remaining sons to just sit down in the dirt and accept defeat. Despite his immense crushing sorrow, he gives them a directive. He tells them to go out, to search diligently for their brother, and crucially, he commands them not to despair in the relief of Allah.
This is the perfect synthesis of clinical reality and spiritual resilience. Yaqub doesn't toxic positivity his way out of it. He acknowledges the severe emotional pain. He is weeping. But he refuses to cross the line into despair.
He commands practical action.
Go and search. Tie your camel. Hope in this paradigm is not a passive wish you make on a star. It requires striving. Despair is what makes a person sluggish and stagnant. True faith requires forward momentum even while your heart is broken and you are carrying the heavy weight of massive uncertainty.
And that profound resilience is what this entire synthesis is aiming for. We started by looking at a modern generation paralyzed by the sheer volume of what-ifs in a phone-based post-COVID world. We mapped the clinical symptoms, the physical tremors, the biological freeze response, and the behavioral avoidance that keeps us trapped.
We broke down the mechanics of CBT. We learned how to distinguish between a practical problem you can solve today and a hypothetical worry you must defer through techniques like worry time. We looked at how digital apps can help lower the barrier to getting that cognitive framework installed in your brain.
But most importantly, we answered the fundamental question that secular therapy cannot answer. Where do those deferred worries actually go? They don't go into the void. Through the active practice of tawakkul, they are handed over to the divine.
True mental wellness does not force you to choose between faith and science. You do not have to pick a side. You can, and you absolutely should, utilize modern psychology to map and manage your cognitive distortions. You need to recognize when your nervous system is parallel parking a speeding car, and you need to use the brakes.
Absolutely.
But you can also rely on tawakkul, on the physiological and spiritual reset of Quranic time blocks, on the holistic wisdom of keeping an empty stomach and seeking righteous company, and on the incredible psychological psychological relief of surrendering your forelock through prophetic duas.
The overarching vital message for anyone listening is this. Your anxiety is a valid emotional storm. It is an injury that requires care, empathy, and practical scientific tools. It is not a spiritual shortcoming.
Never.
You now have a dual toolkit, clinical frameworks to rewire the biology of your alarm system and spiritual anchors to secure your soul when the winds blow.
You've got the tools to build real, lasting resilience. But before we wrap up this deep dive entirely, I want to leave you with one final building concept to mull over, something that ripples beneath everything we've discussed today. We've defined anxiety as an intolerance to uncertainty. We spend all our energy, all our money, all our time trying to predict, control, and secure the future so we never have to feel uncertain.
We fight it constantly.
But if you look at the absolute core of faith, any deep, abiding faith, it requires believing in the unseen. It demands a relationship with the ultimate unknown. So the next time you find yourself awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling in the dark with your heart racing and your mind spinning, I want you to try a psychological exercise. Verbalize that your forelock is out of your hands, feel the relief of that surrender, and then consider this provocative thought.
What if our daily uncertainties aren't just the psychological glitches that need to be aggressively fixed or medicated away?
Exactly. What if that vast, terrifying space of the unknown is actually the exact custom-designed frontier where your deepest spiritual growth is meant to happen?